we're starting? Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. طيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today I wanted to talk about this theme which I believe is quite relevant today in particular, which is how Muslims should view and engage when they see violent conflicts right around the world. Today this is very prominent. The Ukraine crisis, there are a lot of people talking about potential an involvement for the United States. There are a lot of, unfortunately, violent conflicts among the Muslim world. Actually a third of violent conflicts in the past century have been associated with Muslim countries, unfortunately. So there's an overrepresentation of violent conflict in Muslim countries, this is tragically. Now, of course, there is involvement, and there is, if we study these conflicts carefully, we will find that there are external hands imposing or pushing for violent conflict. But at the same time, it's important to think, why is it that we're so susceptible to the impositions of foreign powers trying to make violent conflict happen within Muslim countries? So what's important here is to try to think, especially as outsiders, what we can contribute and how we should view conflicts in general. And that's essentially what I'll try to do, bi'idhnillah. All right. Okay. All right, so preliminaries, I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. If anyone has questions, bismillah, raise your hand. I'm very happy to, have a back and forth. I think that's the only way this workshop can be productive, because in general, it provides a very, abstract skeleton without, questions. Questions can help narrow things down and make them clearer. And if you need any citations or, you have any questions, please let me know. Just raise your hand. I'm very happy, in the middle of the class, to have a discussion. And then also, I wanted to make this clear before I started. This is precisely or primarily about dealing with conflict as outsiders. Of course, as insiders, maybe this is not directly as relevant. So if you're an insider in a conflict, it may be more difficult to make right judgments about what's the right solution. But also, sometimes you may be on the right side, right? Not as an external party trying to push two sides together and make peace between them. So this is specifically discussing such situations where we are not part of the conflict. In many situations, let's say, I think particularly today, in the Palestinian conflict, right? The conflict of Israel subjugating Palestinian people and desecrating holy sites, that's not a situation where this is directly applicable, because that's not a situation where two sides necessarily have legitimate goals. There's clear, very, very clear one-sided oppression. And so some of what's going to be said is applicable in such cases, but much less. But most conflicts tend to be more nuanced than the conflict between, let's say, Israel and Palestine, where you have settler colonialism just entirely subjugating another people, stealing their land systematically over 60 years, right? Most conflicts are much, much more nuanced. Certainly conflicts between Muslims tend to be more nuanced, and we as Muslims should want Muslims to get along together very well. And we as Muslims should also want, when two nations that don't ascribe to Islam but are humans killing each other, we also want them to get along very well. And again, with the current Ukraine crisis, with the Yemen war, with conflict in, let's say, Pakistan now as well, it's important to consider what are the ways to reduce conflict between, again, either two Muslims or two non-Muslims. All right, so why are wars waged? We can't really understand how to reduce wars and how to reduce violent conflict if we don't understand why they occurred to begin with, right? And there are many theories for why wars are waged. Obviously, the truth is probably a mix of a couple of these. For example, Sayyidina Sheikh Muhammad al-Nainawi says that wars at their core are a product of three spirits in us, or three sentiments, evil sentiments in us. It could be greed, It could be ambition, and ambition not in the sense of seeking a better life or seeking goodness, but ambition as in seeking the dunya, right? Ambition for greater, let's say, domination and so on. Ego, seeking a greater ego domination. And then essentially, we said envy, and ambition, and greed, right? I think I mentioned, yeah. So envy is just the first violent conflict, most likely is a source of envy. When Qabil kills Habil alayhi salam, right? It's a result of him feeling very envious that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted Habil's sincere sacrifice to Allah compared to his insincere sacrifice, which led to Habil's being accepted and Qabil's being rejected. Instead, the right way of viewing such a situation, of course, is to say, how can I learn from Habil? How can I learn from my better so I can be better myself? But the spirit of envy or the sentiment of envy says, okay, this person's better, I want to crush them. I want to kill them, just like Qabil killed Habil. That's the first situation. Marxist theory is quite similar to this. Its justification for war is that there's two conflicting classes or categories of people, and the only way that they can essentially fix each other, essentially, is to kill each other, right? Or to dominate each other and erase the other class. So specifically, traditionally, they would speak of bourgeoisie and proletariat, the worker class and the merchant class. And the only way for the worker class to be liberated is to entirely subdue the bourgeoisie class or the merchant class. Another much more prominent theory is anarchy in the international order, because we don't have a world government to punish governments that behave unjustly. Therefore, we're always going to have systematic wars, right? Because whenever a country sees it in its benefit, or a nation or a government, specifically government, sees in its benefit to conquer or harm another nation, it will. Nothing's stopping it. Whereas within a single government, if I try to kill another person, presumably the police will catch me and I have punishments. That does not occur too, There isn't a world government to punish small governments that behave that way. That's an idea. And of course, it has some truth to it, but it also assumes that everybody's out to get other people. Obviously, the reason I don't try to harm any of my other citizens or any of my other brothers and sisters is not because the police are going to get me. That's a very sick worldview. It's probably for other reasons. I have an ethical standard, so on and so forth, but in the most basic interpretation, anarchy in the international order says everyone's very ambitious, seeks to selfishly, and is opportunistic, and the only reason that we have more peace inside governments than in the world stage is because in the world stage there aren't police. There's no international police to stop governments from misbehaving. Power transition theory is basically very similar, where it says there will always be power gaps, and opportunistic governments will try to take over these power gaps as soon as they get an opportunity. Limited resources is another one, because of the fact that we don't live in Jannah where there is an infinite supply of things. People are going to fight over these limited resources, right? And finally, group conflict over history and fractionalization. And this is usually a combination of ambition and envy and greed and so on. So that's usually identity politics are a product of that. When you find that and I would say a lot of Muslim conflicts tend to be a product of group conflict. And fractionalization and ideology really hurling us against each other, unfortunately. And very often, the last category, the group conflict, is the most easily manipulated by outside forces, because of how sensitive things are, you could get you could literally purchase the services of a few people in order to manipulate and begin a bad spiral downwards. Okay, so why war? If war is so inefficient, if it's an inefficient means of settling disputes, why do we see it even happen, right? There are clearly probably better ways in 99% of cases of settling a dispute. And rational actors should be able to bargain to avoid conflict, right? So they can manage a way to deal with the conflict. But what we see is there are two conditions for war to occur. Number one, at least one party must see war as a potential net gain, right? A possibility, all right? They could be wrong. In most cases, I would argue they are wrong. You think it's a net gain, it's a potential net gain, and then you end up having a lose-lose situation. Both sides lose. But at least before the war is waged, there must be at least one party that sees it as a potential net gain. And the second one is that there must be impediments to transparent bargaining to engage in conflict. This means that there are barriers stopping people from transparently communicating what they want and how they can achieve it in normal conflict resolution. So usually when it's person to person, if I have a disagreement with somebody I appreciate or I respect or I love, I can share. This is what I would like to have happen. I don't need to engage in any kind of violence, obviously. It's quite savage to do that. But in such situations, there may be impediments that stop the easy communication of information and preferences and what I think is appropriate or inappropriate. Another very important issue to take into consideration, and we'll try to address all of these problems of how you can address these problems, inshallah, very soon. But there are two types of indivisibilities, and this is a big problem because even if you have communication, if something is indivisible, you can't solve the problem because it's either with you or with your opponent or the person you have conflict with, even if you have communication. So an example of this could be physical indivisibilities. That looks like territory. And of course, in this case, again, going back to the Palestinian the occupation of Palestine, that's a physical indivisibility. There's no way to particularly solve that issue without, from the Israeli side, they're stealing land, right? Like that's a land that can either be owned by the historic owners who are Palestinians or Israelis who have come, or issue indivisibilities. This is different, and I would argue a lot of our problems as Muslims have much less to do with physical indivisibilities and much more to do with issue indivisibilities, right? Going back to physical indivisibilities, and an example of this is also what's happening in Ukraine, right? East Ukraine today is either going to be under Russia or the Ukrainian government, right? They can't be under both. That's a physical indivisibility. You can't exactly share East Ukraine. All right, and with issue indivisibilities, it's things like religion, beliefs, traditions. When people are usually unwilling to compromise certain issues, you find that there are issue indivisibilities. So what can be addressed among the causes of war? Some things can't directly be addressed, like physical indivisibilities presumably can't be directly addressed. However, when we deal with a party seeing things as a potential net gain, having information about the costs of war can actually help reduce war. There are a couple of projects that try to make the costs of war very, very clear. In Brown University, they have literally a project called the Cost of War Project, and it shows how destructive, for example, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan were, and actually it played a good role in influencing political opinion in like leaving Afghanistan and reduction in involvement in Iraq, even though it's not nearly as good as it should be. But that kind of information can actually reduce willingness to enter war. The second impediment, I think this is much more important, is removing the impediments to transparent bargaining, allowing for transparent and easy communication. Now, there are a couple of things that you could do with this. First, it's important to remove the sentiments, which this is very consistent across conflicts, a sentiment of hatred towards the other that makes communication very difficult, right? And that kind of sentiment can only be removed when you slowly have a gradual building of trust, right? So how do you do that? I would the argument that it appears to be done by most peace and conflict scholars is that you need to address the invisible forms of violence, not just the visible. Very often, the focus is on direct violence, but we don't focus on the invisible forms of violence that are the foundations to this direct violence that we see. So Galtung, he's a famous Norwegian peace scholar and economist and mathematician, and he studied this particular phenomenon where he says most people only speak about direct violence. So that looks like visible violence, even cases like abortion, domestic abuse, genocide, terrorism. That's what we see. But behind each one of these forms is structural and cultural violence. Structural violence is where there's legal, political, and socioeconomic structural factors that maintain the violent practices. So you can see that a state maybe rewards a particular behavior, right? Or it doesn't punish some behaviors. That's structural, right? Or, so an example of that is marriage bondage laws. So historically in some countries there were laws that basically make it such that a man can do whatever they want with a woman and they can get away with it. That kind of law structurally perpetuates domestic abuse, right? Similarly, as we'll look into more examples in a moment. Cultural violence is different. It's not a law. It's not about the government. It's not about an institution. It's about beliefs. So cultural violence looks like beliefs that legitimize the structural and direct violence. So things like misogyny, racism, militarism, right? So misogyny is like, let's say, hatred of women or believing women are less than men. Racism is believing some races are less than others or hating them. Militarism is the belief that the only way to solve problems around the world is using military force, right? So going to some examples just to make the ideas clear is that structural violence, it looks like qualified immunity, right? Qualified immunity is the idea that a police officer should be able to, let's say, shoot and even potentially kill out of fear for his own life with no consequence, right? They're immune from being sued because they're in a very difficult job, presumably, and they can only do this job if they have that kind of protection. But this has systematically led to cops being able to get away with murder in some instances. Licenses to abortion clinics can be interpreted as structural violence because you're legitimating this kind of behavior. It's legalized that you can, especially in early, we believe in late stages, it is definitely murder in late stages. So you're justifying that. Identity laws are another example. So banning minority groups from office. This is happening in some countries, unfortunately. And as well as tribalism or sectarianism in the education curriculum. Let's say if you have tribalism and sectarianism are usually cultural violence because it's beliefs. But if it's in the education curriculum where one, like you're systematically justifying that idea, so it becomes structural. All right, cultural violence, like I said, misogyny, militarism, belief that the unborn are not alive, for example. This would be used to justify late-term abortion, so on. Ideologies like nationalism, racial supremacy, communism, secular extremism, and even monarchism. All these ideologies can say, well, if you do this, then we're allowed to engage in violence. If you don't agree with us on particular things, we're allowed to engage in violence to subdue you. Religious extremism is another form. And we see that with extremist organizations, whether they be the Jewish Defense League, which used to kill Arabs and Palestinians who support Palestine, as well as ISIS, right, which killed all kinds of people. All right. Similarities, and so this framework is also very similar to what Sheikh Muhammad al-Nainawi teaches as violence. So according to Sheikh Muhammad al-Nainawi, violence is not just, physical, right? It's intellectual, verbal, and cultural. And Sayyidina Rasulullah is actually the first person in human history to define verbal aggression as violence, right? And this is a hadith in Muslim and Bukhari, so both of the most important and most influential muhaddithin record this and authenticate this hadith, where Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, and I'll explain the story in a moment, but he says, Ya Aisha, inna Allah rafiq yuhibbu al-rifq, wa yu'ti ala al-rifq ma la yu'ti ala al-unf, wa ma la yu'ti ala ma siwa. So the Prophet says, O Aisha, Allah is gentle and loves gentleness, and He grants for gentleness what He does not grant for violence, and what He does not grant for anything else. So the context of the story is that a group of Jews from Khaybar were passing by in Medina, and instead of giving salam to the Prophet ﷺ, they actually said, Assalamu alaikum, right? May poison be upon you, which is like saying may death be upon you, right? It's basically a curse. And they said that, is a way to get away with it. Because if you're saying salam's close to salam, but they were clearly disrespecting the Prophet. And so Sayyidah Aisha, radiallahu anha, says, she replies the equal measure of assalamu alaikum, right? But the Prophet tells her not. He actually tells her not to do that, and he actually categorizes that, replying in equal, as unf, as violence, right? And this is the first time in human history that anybody uses verbal aggression and categorizes verbal aggression as violence, unf, right? That's how the Prophet categorizes it. Whereas literally and everywhere else, violence is a matter of direct physical aggression, not verbal. So here, what we see is that violent extremism and all forms of violence start with ideas. They start with thoughts, right? It starts with the thoughts, then words, and then physical aggression. And the battle starts with ideas. If we're trying to limit violence, if we're trying to remove the sources of violence in whatever conflict we're dealing with, it starts with ideas. We need to remove whatever justifies that violence, whether it's cultural violence or structural violence. We need to uproot the lower end of the pyramid, which allows for the upper end to exist. Because again, the upper end would not exist without it. Okay. And so, conflict transformation would look like, and between nations and individuals, would look like as a first step, trying to see conflict from above. The actors, their goals, their pursuits, their clashes, including you. Right? If you're within a conflict, you have to try your best to try to see what the justification is on the other end. And this may require outside help, like getting people to try to show you your biases, where you may not, your blind spots, and so on. And of course, a lot of humility if you're part of the conflict. Here, I think this is one of the most crucial points. And this is tragic. I'm seeing this especially with the Ukraine problem, for example. I try, whenever there's like a big conflict in the United States and people try to study it very carefully, I try to see different perspectives in media. And what's really wild about this particular conflict is that what the United States media, mainstream media shows is fundamentally different than what the Russian media shows. And I mean the facts are reported totally differently, the narrative is totally different on both ends, right? So one side is saying A, B, C, and the other side is saying X, Y, Z. It's not even A from a different angle. It's not like, oh, look at this different perspective. They're not even reporting the same facts. That's how radical the split is, right? And this is incredibly problematic. And there's propaganda on both ends to justify the conflict from their end. And with these situations, it's practically impossible without amending first the information that's on the different ends and trying to get to at least a different interpretation of the same events, at least. You can't get any reproach, because the reproach is a product of trying to understand the different perspectives, different person's interpretation or different person's perspective on the same issue. If you're seeing entirely different things, and you're not even allowing your own people to see the same thing, you'll have a very big problem. And the worst part is on both ends, the different narratives are banned, literally banned. So if you get, your Reuters and a couple of Russian media programs were banned from Twitter, from YouTube, and so on. And similarly in Russia, they ban all American narrative media. That's incredibly problematic. And for me, as an American, it makes me feel like I cannot trust any end. I cannot have proper information and make any proper judgment, because it's clearly a route for manipulation. And it's very important that we demand to having better media coverage on both ends if we were to want to see that kind of conflict transformation for nations. Of course, this is equally true for individuals, right? If you're having all these rules apply similarly, if let's say there are marital problems, right? If you're seeing fundamentally different things, you can't have rapprochement. And so the first step is to try to empathize with the other person and try to see where they're coming from and how they interpret the same thing differently. All right. And the second thing is to try to be even-handed. What this means is, despite you having your own perspective, you need to try to find a solution that is just towards both ends, or like several ends. And then, after you've done both, notice, in both of these cases, you're not making a judgment of what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. You're just trying to see the other person's perspective. The third step is to have a legitimacy test, right? To try to say, are these goals legitimate? Are these pursuits, or ends legitimate or not? First, you try to understand, and then the third step would be really to try to judge if this is good or bad. Because once you've understood, you can make a better judgment to begin with. Whereas when we try to judge without understanding very clearly, that could could go south, essentially. Because you're not even allowing for that empathy to arise between human beings. And that empathy is essential to conflict resolution. Any questions so far? Any thoughts? No? All right. So the fourth part of conflict transformation is then to look at those legitimate goals, which everybody, presumably, when we're dealing with conflict, there are legitimate goals in a conflict, and we should ask, what are the minimum changes for a compelling vision, right? And maximum accommodation of all legitimate goals. Like, trying to get at the source of what this person wants, and how can they get at the source of what they want, and I get the source of what I want, even if it's 50-50, right? Or some kind of maximum accommodation. It could be 50-50, it could be 80-80, and so on and so forth. And finally, enact that vision. And what's very important about the fifth step here is that it very likely will fail the first time, and the second time, and the third time. So that hope is very important, because you're going to end up having to repeat endlessly, right? In different until you find that arrangement that works for a very long time. So one arrangement could work for a year, another for 2 years, 3 years, and then it fails. And then repeating until you learn what kind of arrangement works best is very important. Again, this could apply to things as great as government wars. It could also apply to smaller, let's say, community violence. It could also apply to marriage, or like simple brotherhood, brother-sister problem, or brother-brother problem, and so on and so forth. Okay. The next thing I wanted to touch upon, which is quite short before we end, is on non-violence. But before I make that transition, does anyone have a question, any thoughts, comments at all, or a practical situation?
What would you classify, like here in the greater Little Rock area, we've had some problems with gun violence. How would you kind of classify that type of violence on that type of level, on such a, almost a street level?
Yeah, usually that would be classified as community violence, and it seems that very often, and I'm not an expert on gang violence whatsoever, and so I have to make that caveat very clear. But it is certainly true that there is dehumanization of other gangs from within a gang, and that would be the cultural violence that needs to be addressed as a first step. There is also, very often, there's lack of proper public goods or opportunities, and I would say that's structural violence on the end of like legal institutions that don't allow a lot of these individuals who join gangs to take other routes. So it becomes the most profitable route for people to take that route in their short-term perspective, obviously, because that's the best we can do. So there are cultural elements to it and structural elements to that kind of violence that need to be addressed. Usually, the most successful efforts at ending gang violence tend to not be government-led at all. They're very community-led, sometimes by even outsiders who just know a lot about the culture, and they try to limit that. Or people who've been to prison and had a change of mind and then go back and try to create rapprochement. And very often, the strategy is humanization, right? You're never going to, it's almost very often impossible to heal wounds of one side killing your people, especially when the person's known. But very often, like, the changes are very humble and small, and that's enough just to end the violence. Because sometimes the best thing you need is a healthy distance, right? And that's one of the problems with, let's say, government wars, especially when two countries are very close to each other. The healthy distance is not an option. But within a society, healthy distance is an option. Within a marriage, healthy distance is an option. Within, like, a family, even sometimes, if you have a very, very abusive relationships, we don't want to have bitter relationships with our family members. Right? That's not an acceptable thing. Again, unless something is unforgivable, certainly always it's better to forgive, but the point is, sometimes the most optimal solution is healthy distance. Does that make sense?
Yes.
In our tradition, in our culture, the subcontinent families, there's a lot of cultural violence. Verbal violence is everywhere, but a lot of cultural violence. Especially we see that a lot between the kids and the parents. But unfortunately, the parents do not have capacity to understand, like differentiate the cultural violence or the physical violence or the verbal violence. So lots of time the parents also suffer with that and the kids also suffer with that. And at some point, some parents don't even want to understand this stuff. So often, sometimes the kids also don't understand the parents. So how would you, like, what would be the solution for that? How can you resolve that conflict or that violence?
I think two things have to occur simultaneously, or not necessarily simultaneously, but in the same direction. The first thing is, for most of these conflicts, it requires, like, a social entrepreneur, right? Which means someone who sees an opportunity to teach people about certain things. Like, you're, as a person, anyone doing da'wah is essentially behaving as a social entrepreneur. You have to educate parents on one end, as well as children, of what are healthy methods of navigating, let's say, parental oppression or parental subjugation. But at the same time, I think parents will learn to give more rights to children when they see to what extent they're losing them to things like the internet, right? To things like the opportunities that they now have, that they historically didn't have. So historically, parental oppression or subjugation was probably more prevalent precisely because children didn't have any other routes, like leaving, right? But I'll give you an example. In the Yemeni Detroit community, a lot of, like, first generation immigrants or second generation immigrants tend to, like, still hold very, I would say, inappropriate beliefs that don't come from Islam, but they're cultural beliefs that were present in Yemen, and they have them in Detroit. And in Detroit, you could leave, or Dearborn, right? Like, these are areas with a lot of Yemeni Americans. And they leave. The children who feel very oppressed, they literally actually leave their parents, their parents' household. And when they do that, what ends up, the knowledge of, and this is tragic, of course, I don't support that kind of route, but then other parents start to learn the consequences that actually they do have other options, right? And it's very important for me to re-strategize. Again, this is very similar to how entrepreneurs act, right? Like, you have started business, it fails, you learn, okay, that's probably not how it should work. Maybe I should change something about my business strategy. And human beings, there's a lot of, unfortunately, ideally we learn from simulation. We see someone else, like, fail, and we learn from them. But our capacity to observe is so limited that sometimes we have to learn from our own trial and error. And that's a structural aspect, right? That kids today have so many other opportunities that they didn't have in a lot of poor countries, that the historic, like, the parental subjugation is simply not going to be available, or not going to be sustainable, I should say. Yeah, and then the route that we want to take is, hopefully it's never has to get to the negative structural escape. We want to engage in education and doing da'wah, so that parents know the prophetic way of teaching children and of guidance, as opposed to subjugation and oppression.
Mentioned earlier that, like, abortion can be seen as a form of cultural violence, and, like, clinics can be seen as, like, taught by the community. I guess I'm just not fully understanding, like, where that would come from, I guess. Like, could you explain that a bit more?
Sure. I'm realizing that I kind of put that and didn't explain much. So I thank you for raising this question. I appreciate it. When I say that, I want to be clear that I mean late-term abortion, right? For Muslims, overwhelming majority of so a lot of scholars, there are disagreements between scholars about when life enters. But regardless of the disagreement, let's say the latest opinion is a Maliki opinion that life enters during the third month, 120 days, right? When life enters, the fetus is alive, right? So it's important to understand that a belief, so when we see people justifying abortion in, let's say, the 6th month or the 5th month, during these periods of time, they're usually founding it first on cultural beliefs. The belief that nothing is alive until birth is given, right? What we're saying is, from our perspective, and this is not a scientific question, right? Science can never really answer when life enters. That's not a scientific question. You can try to make analogies, like the neurons start working during this period, and that's like usually associated with like pain reception, right? But pain reception neurons actually start during the 10th week. The very beginning of pain reception is during the 10th week of pregnancy. So that's very early. So it's not clear when, and that doesn't necessarily say anything about the ruh, so to speak. But we're particularly, and when it comes to like violence, we're particularly saying when the spirit or when the soul enters the body of the fetus. And so whenever you believe it enters the body of the fetus, anything beyond that is, sure, no problem. Bismillah. Whenever you believe the soul enters the body, beyond that, it would be accurately understood as murder of a different category, certainly. It's not like killing, let's say, if someone were to murder indirectly a man, but it's still violence, right? It's a form of violence. Does that make sense? Broadly, at least. If you think I've said anything wrong, please push back. I'm very happy to have a discussion.
I mean, I guess I'm just like, I think the licensing part is where I'm still a little bit confused about, because I understand that people will have different ideas of when, like, life is given, like, within the womb, whether that's just, like, when the, like birth or whatever. But I feel like because those views are still vastly different, I feel like categorizing, having, like, licenses to abortion clinics as a form of cultural violence, I'm not really sure, just because, especially somewhere like America where different cultures have such different views on it, like, I don't really think that there can be a definitive understanding of whether or not that's cultural violence.
I see your perspective. I think that's a valid point. But I do think that the question ultimately is, what's the best approximation of truth? And I don't think that it's true that there is no life beyond the third month. And especially, again, coming from an Islamic perspective. So I'm teaching specifically from the Islamic moral judgment perspective, right? For a Muslim, there's no claim beyond the third month. So if there's a license, I'm not saying as a category, abortion clinics as a category, licenses for, let's say, beyond the third month, like legalizing abortion in second trimester or third trimester, that kind would be considered violence. First trimester abortion don't follow that category. So I should have been more specific. So thank you for raising that question. Does that make sense or better sense? Okay. Any questions from the ladies' side?
I do have a question. Assalamu
Alaikum
alaikum.
salam.
I apologize, I arrived late, but I'm interested in, I'm very interested in the concept of agency, right? And you may have covered this while I wasn't here, but I'm very interested in the concept of agency. What Imam Nawaz talked about was sort of this cultural violence, right? Or even if you think about what's happened yesterday in Palestine, right? It's this concept of when people don't give others agency, then they don't feel human. They're not perceived as human.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in this concept of agency because parents, I worry, in this country, don't treat, I'm going to cause controversy here, don't treat their children as if they had full agency.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't
That's true.
treat that, then you can never legitimize your children's opinions. So I'm sort of interested in your thoughts on that.
I think that's entirely accurate, and certainly limiting agency, especially that can be structural. I think it's particularly pernicious when it's a form of, like, it's structurally justified, so legally justified. But certainly there are some cultural justifications of it, and that can also be potentially pernicious. And it's a fine line because certainly, especially children, let's say, who are at a younger age, at a younger side of being a child, they don't know what's best for them. So that kind of guidance is necessary. So it's certainly tricky how to offer guidance without without subjugating them and allowing them to, fail sometimes and experience that agency. Because if they're not allowed to fail or make mistakes, they're going to have problems when they grow up, and they're certainly going to be somewhat resentful or maybe even want to experiment more so. It's probably going to have developmental effects. So I definitely agree. That's a legitimate concern, I think, entirely, especially for Muslims who live in the United States where other children are given so much more agency. That comparison is definitely going to lead to, I think, negative results. So we as a Muslim community have to be able to offer children more agency and within healthy boundaries. And deciding that is, I think, case by case. So it should definitely be case by
Or
case.
even boys versus girls, right?
Right.
We certainly have more, teenage boys have more agency than our teenage girls, or women even, right, in our cultures. Not Islamically, I'm saying, but in our cultures, we have that same issue.
Yeah. And I think that, my perspective, and I want to be very clear that I'm not speaking from a position as though, like, I'm not saying the Islamic position here. That's my personal perspective, which is limited. I think that the excessive agency granted to boys, I think there is excessive agency granted to very young boys, ends up harming them. I think a lot of Muslim men in the Western context end up being less responsible than they ought to be because of the excessive agency they're granted. Very often, what you mentioned is suggested to say that women should be granted more agency. And I think that's true. Like, young women should be granted somewhat, a marginal amount of additional agency. But that's also true that young, I think, Muslim men should be granted less agency. They're given way too much freedom to mess up, and less responsibilities than historically Islam imposes on them on one end, and just like our culture requires of young men. And I think that's very unhealthy. So sometimes a little bit less agency can be good for people under 18 or like in the developmental phase. Yeah. Please go ahead. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Could you define that agency that you're talking about, and what kind of structure you use for the agency?
Sure. This is like a very big question in political science and philosophy, because I don't think there's a single definition for it, but I would say broadly being able to enact one's will, right? At least in a negative way. So there's like positive agency and negative agency. Positive agency is the ability to enact one's will through having resources, right? Negative agency is being able to enact one's will because you don't have barriers against enacting your own will, right? So especially in the parental context, having agency means like basically not having your parents create unjustified barriers against your will. And of course, unjustified here is culturally contingent, or like contextual. I shouldn't say culturally. It's contextually contingent. It's not like it applies in every single context equally. But for example, what I think is justified agency in the United States may not be the same as justified agency elsewhere. Wallahu a'lam. That's why case by case is so important. Yeah.
Again, I guess my question is there a moral context to the agency? Because again, what I'm referring to as the context of agency, I assume is a spoiled child. That spoiled child in the common language, street language, is that spoiled child is not disciplined, either from a moral perspective or either from a physical perspective, meaning that he or she do what she want to do without any restraint. And so is there a moral perspective that we should look at in terms of defining that agency?
Yeah, I think it's entirely moral. I agree with you entirely. It's definitely a moral category, like whether someone ought to have agency or not. I agree with you, and I think that moral training can, in some circumstances, justify, especially for younger, individuals, can justify reductions in agency. But I also think that it's wise of parents to be very conscious to what extent they're limiting agency. Just because, children very often tend to be exposed to other people who have so much more agency that they think is good. Usually that agency to I think a lot of American kids is bad. It's not good for their own development. But they tend to be exposed to that. So wherever we can grant them that kind of agency, whether it's positive or negative agency, within the halal, I think it's very valuable that we do. So for example, giving children money to give to charity instead of imposing it on them, right? Let's say teaching women or like young ladies modesty out of making them desire it as opposed to imposing it on them. Anything that makes them feel like they're in control is very important because they're going to live in a society where ultimately they're responsible. And limiting the areas where you're imposing things on them is very important. I should say with modesty, it's men and women, yeah, equally. But that's just tends to be a bigger problem within our community. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
In American society, we feed our children the dunya, the material things, as a perimeter for their being raised, okay, rather than any more context. And I guess I'm speaking from the experience of my grandmother was very, very moral person.
MashaAllah.
And so simple things like drinking and stuff like that wasn't allowed, okay.
MashaAllah.
And then we talking about in the 50s, so when I was growing up with my grandmother, but the same context is that was a moral conviction that stood in the house versus what I call academic. Well, you ain't supposed to do this because.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so, and I think by us having a moral perspective on all our agencies, that it's easier for us to at least teach that versus trying to enforce that.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if you don't teach it, it's not relevant.
Yeah, I agree entirely. You're absolutely right.
What she was referring to is the context of this society is that the influence of others who don't have that agency have a tendency to have them inclined toward
Evil.
people who don't have any agency at all.
Right. No, that's right. I think maximizing agency doesn't always come in form of, or like in a good way, again, within the halal. I'm not saying like within haram, right? But that can also look like not only providing reason-based arguments to justify things, but also heart-based arguments. How does that make you feel? Does this harm your well-being, your spiritual well-being? Getting children used to that kind of judgment, like using their heart for judgment, is also healthy for their own moral training. And I think that's very rarely used. Again, today, and I think historically 50 years ago, 70 years ago, my grandparents certainly didn't have to go through reason-based arguments to justify limits to their agency. And whether it's self-imposed or externally imposed. And I think any wise person would self-impose limits to their own agency. We need that. But at the same time, today that's not going to fly on people who don't have good reasons to, because we're in a world where we're exposed to people without that agent, with that agency, sorry. So we ask, why am I limiting myself? So there has to be reason. Where my grandparents lived, they didn't live in a society where other people did have agency. They never had to ask, why am I different? And so the reason why you're different needs to be answered either by appealing to reason, mind reason, or like heart reason, or like, appealing to this own child's moral convictions that they've formed through their own experience. Wallahu a'lam. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can conclude. Bismillah. Please go ahead.
So you mentioned how we should let people feel more in control instead of imposing rules and regulations upon them, just forcing things upon them. How do you think the Islamic perspective would apply to countries in that sense, such as like Saudi Arabia, where the hijab would be quote unquote enforced? Like, how would you explain that from like an American and Islamic perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are disagreements on to what extent and what kind of rules, Islamic rules, governments are supposed to enforce, right? And the concept, so everything that is under the had and governments need to enforce. So hudud in the Quran, governments have to enforce. But with the hijab, and by the way, Saudi does not enforce the hijab. At least they haven't in the past 6 years. They stopped enforcing hijab. It's the only government that enforces hijab is basically Iran in the entire planet. And even Iran loosely enforces it. It's not, usually the enforcement of hijab, to the extent that it's enforced not out of someone's will, it's social, right? There's a social, like a sense of peer pressure, more so than it is like governmental. But yeah, there are disagreements between scholars, but certainly many scholars did not believe that it's legal for a government to impose things which are done out of conviction. Just like with salah, right? Most scholars don't believe that you're allowed to enforce salah, or you're allowed to impose salah on people, or siyam. So these categories, to the extent that they exist, tend to be appealing to extremist scholars. Like in Saudi, historically, they had a lot more power than they do today. So the government is doing these things in order to please that category of society, more so than it is doing it to follow Islamic law. It's a powerful minority that you have to appease. And certainly, very often, we're not tolerant to different ideas within Islam. So it's not like there's a homogenous Islamic opinion. Plenty of scholars don't believe that these things ought to be enforced by the state. But the way they would be sustained, and I think this is what's very important, is having lively civil society organizations which teach people, right? The very big problem in many of our societies and Muslim countries is that civil society organizations are seen as a threat. So you don't want to develop them. So the only way of maintaining that kind of religiosity is for the state to do this. But that's not the Islamic solution. The Islamic solution is having da'wah. So these governments have a paradox, where on one end, the people want to have religiosity, but the governments don't want it to be endogenous. They don't want it to be produced from within. It has to be imposed from outside. Because if it's produced within, the same organizations that will teach people about hijab could be teaching people about democracy, could be teaching people about values that are antithetical to the values that the government wants them to teach. So they don't want to give agency to these civil society organizations. So that's the paradox. And inshallah, in the next 100 years, we'll see our Muslim countries, evolving and overcoming that challenge. Wallahu a'lam. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Any other questions before we conclude? All right, bismillah.
I wanted to ask about like internal conflict, sort of like the violence within that causes someone to be reactive. Because I think, I don't know if this is just like a blanket American thing, or I've run into this a lot, where someone feels the need to hear their own voice, to silence the voice of another, to kind of like shut out the other person's reason. I mean, we see this like on a really big scale, like in the government context, like certain political candidates for running for president. But I just wonder about like what sort of advice you have, practical advice for sort of taking ownership of, like, not suppressing, but kind of keeping oneself like contained and within, like operating in society in like in a better way than just like making their voice the loudest.
That's difficult because it's definitely case by case, right? There are so many different factors that an individual will face in such situations that it's difficult to account for all these different factors. Would I be giving advice to the person who shuts others down, or am I giving advice to the person being shut down? Because it seems like
Yeah, because it seems like the person that would shut other people down wouldn't be willing to take advice to begin with. So I guess how I can better ask is the person who witnesses this happening for them to not react and get upset, but to just, maybe this happens like, I feel like every day.
I think the way I would approach this, which is not necessarily the most ideal way, I'm not suggesting it is, but it's one perspective that can be taken into consideration, is a means-end argument. That usually the people who shut others down have goals, and that their goals almost certainly are not best reached by the means that they're taking, which is shutting people down. So I think a very good way and a very healthy way of changing people's behavior is showing how their behavior is not good for them. Not that it's not good for me. If I tell them it's not good for me, but it's good for them, they'll continue doing it, unless they're very altruistic or empathic, which presumably such a person isn't. Clearly, they're shutting down, knowing that who they're shutting down is not benefiting from that kind of behavior. They're protecting themselves from whatever they're feeling inside. So trying to figure out, first of all, what's the goal of this person deep down? There are external goals, there are also deep goals. This person may want to feel respected, right? This person may want to feel heard, right? So if that's the case, then maybe offering more respect when someone doesn't do this, so rewarding good behavior and making this person feel heard even when they don't shut others down, and then making it very clear that when they shut people down, they're neither get the respect that they want, nor are they heard, is one way of addressing it. And also, the ends could be totally non-emotional. It could be, like in a political context, it could be desiring more popularity, more support, etc. But if you're able to make a compelling argument that actually doesn't give them the support they want, certainly not in the long run, even if it's a short-run support, that's probably a more effective strategy. It's called incentive compatibility. So whenever this is related to, I apologize, I've probably made too many economics references because I study economics, so it's my apologies. But incentive compatibility is very important for economies in transition. So when governments change, if you want to make this change sustainable, you need to make sure that the people who lose power don't have some other power that they gained in order for the transition to occur. It could look like temporary power, like just literally buying them out so you can have better government, better economies, less corruption, and so on and so forth. But you almost always have to please the people you're removing to a certain degree, or at least threaten them enough that they're willing to leave, which is an undesirable. I don't think it's reasonable to threaten people. But yeah, you have to make it incentive compatible to induce change. Wallahu a'lam. We're wrapping up. Okay. Bismillah. All right. I'm going to end very quickly with the simple case for nonviolence. I strongly believe that in our context today, especially, we should have a very strong preference and a very strong inclination towards nonviolence as Muslims. Again, this is not necessarily categorical. There are instances where self-defense is necessary. This is not saying that you ought to be a pacifist, but that we have to have a very strong inclination towards nonviolent conflict resolution strategies, right? As a moral imperative. So, number one, for Islam, the problem of violence is an integral part of the Islamic moral sphere. And number two, violence, if any, used by Muslims must be governed by rules prescribed in the Quran and Hadith. Right? To the extent that we're permitted to use it, we have to be confined by the rules of the Quran and Sunnah. Number 3, if violence used cannot discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, then it is unacceptable in Islamic jurisprudence. Because Islamic jurisprudence, because the Quran and Sunnah, necessitate differentiating combatants and civilians, right? Non-combatants. Number 4, modern technology of destruction renders discrimination virtually impossible at present, right? It becomes very difficult to separate the combatants from the non-combatants. Think of nuclear warfare, right? Which is literally last month, some people were talking about, maybe it's worth it to get into nuclear warfare with Russia, as though that's like an even moderately or broadly desirable end. It's a total disaster. All right. And number 5, in the modern world, Muslims cannot use weapons of mass destruction while being completely true to their faith. All right, because of the fact that you're going to have to kill non-combatants, civilians, which according to the Quran and Sunnah, it's impermissible to kill. Number 6, Islam teaches Muslims to fight for justice with the understanding that human lives, as all parts of God's creation, are purposive and sacred. Right? All, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah says in the Quran that Allah has given special status to Banu Adam, right? A special karam, a position of karama, to be clear. Number 7, in order to be true to Islam, Muslims must utilize nonviolent action as a new mode of struggle. Right? To the extent that you want to solve problems, it must be through nonviolence, even if it means regime change or things like that. It should be committed to nonviolence. And there have been many successful nonviolent regime change examples that we can learn from as Muslims. And number 8, the Muslim world is potentially fertile soil for nonviolence and nonviolent strategy because of its potential for disobedience, strong discipline, sharing and social responsibility, perseverance and self-sacrifice, and the belief in the unity of the Muslim community and the oneness of mankind. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد والسلام عليكم. At your service.
You too?